What's up everyone, I'm Silver, and since Cold War officially just released today, I figured I'd make a quick video running through the display settings that you need to change as soon as you boot up the game if you're playing on PC. Now as you can see here, my computer's running a super low frame rate. I think this is because the game automatically set all of my settings to ultra, and while the game may look really good, this actually does make it to where it's almost unplayable because the motion blur and all of the really low frames makes it just seem super clunky and super blurry. So let's go ahead and take a look at the settings that we need to go through and change in order to increase the frames per second. As you can see right now, my game's getting anywhere between 30 and 50 frames per second. Some stuff may look really good and the detail is really clear. However, 30 to 50 frames per second is worse than a PS4 is getting on this game, and we need to go through and make some changes to the settings in order to fix this. So go ahead and pull up the graphics tab in the settings menu and we'll take a look at what settings you need to change. So for display mode, you always want to have that set to full screen. If you're alt-tabbing a lot, then you could set it to windowed full screen, but you are going to lose a little bit of frames per second by doing that. My refresh rate on my monitor is 240 Hz, so I'm going to leave that right there. Gameplay VSync and menu VSync. I'm going to turn both of these off as they can cause some screen tearing, especially since I'm running a G-Sync monitor. NVIDIA Reflex Low Latency, I'm going to leave on enabled boosted. For display resolution, I always recommend 1920 by 1080, even if you're using a 1440 or a 4K monitor, setting it to 1920 by 1080 is going to increase your frames per second. But typically you just want to have this right at 100. You can actually reduce this a little bit if you're absolutely stretching to get the most frames possible, but it can make the game look pretty bad. Aspect ratio, leave to automatic. If you change this, it's going to put black bars at the top and bottom of the screen. Colorblind modes, for this game I'm going to leave completely turned off. For field of view, you can set this to whatever you want. I play with mine at 110, and the higher the number that you have, the more you're able to see around your screen as you're looking around. Setting a higher field of view can reduce your frames per second by a little bit because it is rendering more on your screen at a time. Now the reason I play at 110 is because my ADS field of view is set to affected. This means when I zoom in, it's not going to reduce the field of view that I'm seeing, so I can still see more around me, but it does make it a little bit harder to aim at enemies that are a little bit farther away. If you struggle hitting shots on enemies that are farther away, you can change this to independent and it'll make it to where it zooms in more whenever you ADS. For brightness, I set mine to 65, even though that's a little bit higher than what it recommends. I like playing to where I can see a little bit better in dark areas. You're going to want to change the frame rate limit from unlimited to custom. If you leave it on unlimited, it can be a little bit too taxing on your graphics card because it's trying to hit the absolute highest frames per second possible, even though your monitor can't even achieve those numbers. So you're going to want to set the gameplay limit to whatever your monitor's refresh rate is set to. Since mine's 240, I'm going to set my gameplay limit to 240. You can also set this a little bit lower to get more consistent frames if your computer's not able to hit as high of frames as your monitor's refresh rate. And then you can leave the menu limit and the minimize limit down to 60 because those don't really matter. You don't actually have to get good frames when you're in the menus. I turned my texture quality down to medium. I think it looks pretty decent still, but it does increase the frames per second by lowering this. Model quality I set to low. Special effects quality I leave on high. I disabled screen space reflection. And then I set the object view distance to high. And then going into shadow and lighting, these settings can affect the frames per second by a lot without really reducing the quality of how the game looks. So volumetric lighting I set to low, shadow quality I also set to low, dynamic shadows I leave on because that makes it to where you can see your own shadow but you also see the enemy's shadows. So if there's an enemy standing above you or behind you, if you can see their shadow to give away their position, it can be useful in the game. Special effects shadows I disabled. I also disabled the weapon shadow. Moving on to ray tracing, these settings make the game look really good, but they do have a huge impact on frames. So I went through and turned all of these down to disabled. Moving on to post-processing effects, anti-aliasing quality I set to disabled. Ambient occlusion quality I also set to disabled. And then you're going to want to completely disable motion blur because if you have it turned on, it's just going to make the game look blurry as you're moving around. Subsurface scattering doesn't really do anything for you in game, so I disabled that. Order independent transparency is also disabled. And then the final tab is the advanced tab. I set my VRAM usage target to high, just so that it can utilize as much of the graphics card as possible. And then if you're playing on a monitor, you're going to want to have the display gamma set to sRGB. If you're playing on a TV, you can change it to REC 709. And then display adapter, you just want to make sure that that's set to the graphics card that you have in your computer. Go ahead and hit apply and go back to the game. So as you can see right now, I'm running 150 to 170 frames per second, whereas before I was only getting like 30 to 50. The game runs much smoother now and it feels a lot better to play. Before I was having a really hard time moving around because everything was super blurry. The textures on certain objects looked really good, but it was just too hard to play the game with that low of frames. Right now, I'm still running a really old graphics card. I have a 1070 Ti, so for me, getting 150 frames per second is actually pretty decent. With the settings I changed, I think the game still looks really good, but it increased the frames per second by a lot. There are a couple of things that I could probably go in and turn down to increase it even more, but I'd like for the game to at least look decent with good frames per second, rather than look really bad with excellent frames. So again, if you guys found this video useful at all, let me know by dropping a like on it. And if you want to easily be able to find your way back for more Call of Duty tips and tricks, consider hitting the subscribe button and turning on notifications. If you guys have any questions about any of the settings that I went over, go ahead and ask me in the comment section and I'll get back to you. Thanks again so much for watching. I'm Silver, and I'll see you in the next one.